29 сентября 1957 года взорвалась емкость с жидкими радиоактивными отходами, содержавшая 20 миллионов кюри радиоактивности. За 10 часов радиоактивное облако накрыло Челябинскую, Свердловскую, Тюменскую области и охватило территорию 23 тысячи квадратных километров.
The Soviet Union operated more than 100 secret cities, scattered across Eurasia, from Estonia to Kazakhstan. Their primary objective, the production of weapons of mass destruction. Today, at least 43 of them remain closed cities, virtually inaccessible to foreigners. In this video, we tell the story of one of them. In 1957, the world was on edge. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki were turned to ash, the yardstick of global power had shifted. While the United States consolidated its lead through mastery of the thermal cycle, the Soviet Union saw an existential threat. To the Kremlin, this power gap was an invitation to political coercion. Achieving nuclear parity became the state's absolute priority. Under this crushing pressure, the Soviet nuclear program was built to produce as much as possible, in the shortest time imaginable. Plant quotas weren't calculated by engineers worried about valves, they were dictated by politicians, worried about deadlines. The order was simple: find plutonium, or you'll see the inside of a Siberian mine. On paper, the engineering was glorious. In practice, it was a house of horrors. For the Soviets, the risk of becoming a mutant was an acceptable trade-off, compared to the fear of seeing Moscow burn to the ground. The Soviet response to the nuclear race began with a city that, officially, did not exist. Deep in the Ural Mountains, far from borders and any major urban centers, the state decided to build an entire industrial complex in total secrecy. It was a space isolated from the rest of the country, designed to operate in the shadows. This gave the Soviets a dangerous sense of, if no one is watching, we can do it our way. This place was called Mayak. Around it rose Chelyabinsk 40, a closed city that appeared on no maps, received no visitors, and could never be mentioned in correspondence. For those who lived there, it was a life of privilege, surrounded by barbed wire. The workers at Mayak lived far better than the average Soviet citizen. Comfortable apartments, good wages, well-equipped schools. In exchange, they accepted rigid rules: never speak of your work, ask no questions, and never leave without authorization. Many didn't even know what they were producing. They only knew it was important and dangerous. They gave you an apartment with hot water and steak for dinner, in exchange for your soul. If something went wrong, there would be no press, no public investigation. Illnesses could be reclassified, accidents could be renamed. If you had handed the Mayak blueprints to a German or American engineer at the time, they would have said, "This needs 4 backup systems, 10 redundancy sensors, and double containment." The Russians simply looked at it and said, "What for? The concrete is thick and the grass is tall. If it leaks, no one will see." When Mayak went operational, there was no room for delays, prolonged testing, or design reviews. Every day without production was seen as a failure. The complex functioned like a non-stop assembly line, driven by political quotas from the top, never by safety standards. Plutonium does not exist in nature. It is a byproduct created inside a nuclear reactor. This process transforms a tiny fraction of uranium into plutonium. To extract this precious material, the Soviets at Mayak would drop massive uranium bars into tanks of boiling acid. The acid dissolved the metal, turning solid uranium into a liquid broth. The efficiency was terrifyingly low. For every single gram of plutonium extracted, they were left with about 150 liters of an acidic liquid, highly radioactive, extremely hot, and completely useless. But it was deadly. Even before any explosion, the first major catastrophe was already underway. When Mayak began operations, the solution for plutonium waste was simple: dump it directly into the Teka River. Between 1949 and 1951, millions of cubic meters of highly radioactive liquid waste were discharged into the river. This was a deliberate, continuous, and authorized disposal. The Teka flowed through dozens of rural villages, where the water was used for everything: drinking, cooking, washing clothes, and watering livestock. No one was warned. To the locals, the river looked exactly the same. The first signs appeared quickly. People began falling ill without explanation. Strange skin burns, constant fatigue, hair loss, and children with bone deformities. Local doctors recognized the pattern, but they were forbidden from naming it. The term radiation sickness was outlawed. In medical records, vague expressions and generic diagnoses appeared. The problem existed in the victims' bodies, but it wasn't allowed to exist on paper. In villages like Musliumovo, the population continued living on the banks of the Teka for years. They fished in the river. They farmed in soil irrigated by that water. They drank milk from cows that grazed on contaminated land. Radiation arrived as a daily process, nearly invisible. When a child showed up at the hospital with a leg as thin as a dry twig, the doctor, with the barrel of a KGB revolver pressed against the back of his neck, would write vitamin deficiency or viral infection in the file. Dumping waste into the river solved an immediate problem, while transferring the risk to voiceless people, far from the centers of power. When dumping into the river became impossible to ignore, they decided to store the most dangerous liquid waste in underground tanks. Starting in 1953, 20 thick-walled stainless steel tanks were built, resting on massive reinforced concrete bases, buried nearly 27 feet below the surface. They received the waste through pipes connected to chemical reprocessing facilities. Even after being filled to capacity, a tank remained in active service. It continued to generate heat continuously for decades due to radioactive decay. Decay is the process by which unstable atoms transform into more stable ones over time. During this transformation, they release radiation and thermal energy, turning each tank into a pressure cooker that could reach 750 degrees Fahrenheit. To control this heat, the tanks were lined with cooling jackets and coils through which water circulated, absorbing the heat from the metal walls and carrying it out of the system. This kept the tanks below 160 degrees. This industrial radiator could never fail. If the water circulation were interrupted, the tank would keep heating up, with no mechanism capable of limiting the temperature while repairs were made. Pumps had to maintain an uninterrupted flow. Valves had to remain open. Pipes could not clog. The entire system depended on electrical power, regular maintenance, and continuous monitoring in an era of vacuum tubes and mechanical relays. On the afternoon of September 29, 1957, there was no sign that anything was about to happen. The complex was operating as usual, but inside tank number 14, the temperature had crossed the critical point. The liquid no longer existed as a stable solution. What remained was a parched mass of nitrate and acetate salts, continuously heated by radioactive decay. At this stage, there was no turning back. Disaster was only a matter of time. At 4:20 p.m., a thermal explosion occurred, triggered by the buildup of heat and the instability of the material. The energy released was equivalent to dozens of tons of TNT. The 160-ton concrete lid that sealed the tank was tossed like a frisbee, taking the thick layer of soil above it with it. A cloud of radioactive dust was shot nearly 3,000 feet into the sky. Inside Mayak, the damage seemed minor. There was no massive crater, no destroyed reactor. In that moment, it was easy to underestimate what had happened. But the true disaster wasn't at the blast site. It was in what had been cast out of it. The wind was blowing to the northeast. Over the following hours, radioactive particles began to fall silently over forests, farmland, and entire villages. No sirens wailed, no warnings were given. People simply went about their lives. Strontium-90 is one of the most dangerous isotopes released by the explosion because of how it behaves inside the human body. Chemically, strontium is very similar to calcium. The human body can't tell them apart. It is the ultimate con artist of the periodic table. It shows up in your body with a fake ID, pretending to be calcium. Your bones, which need calcium to stay strong, let it right in. But instead of strengthening the structure, the strontium begins to destroy the bone marrow, leaving you to struggle just to produce white blood cells. The material has a half-life of about 29 years. This means that once it's lodged in the bone tissue, it continues to emit radiation for decades, right from within the body. Unlike external radiation, internal radiation cannot be avoided. It follows the individual everywhere. Even if a person fled to the other side of the world, the 1957 disaster was literally written in their skeleton, increasing the risk of leukemia, bone cancers, chronic anemia, and immune system failure. The bodies of those exposed to strontium-90 back then could be identified by Geiger counters even centuries after they are buried. Children were particularly affected. Because the Soviet diet was often calcium deficient, their bodies were starving. When strontium-90 reached the milk, their systems absorbed it like it was a feast, accelerating the destruction of their bones. In growing bodies, the absorption rate is higher. Milk played a central role. Cows grazing on contaminated land ingested strontium-90 from the soil and vegetation. The isotope passed into the milk, consumed daily by families. The radiation in the mother's bodies echoed through the DNA of their fetuses for 3 generations. As mentioned before, after the explosion, the radioactive cloud was caught by winds blowing to the northeast, transforming into a narrow strip of contamination that crossed fields, forests, and villages. This invisible corridor later became known as the East Urals Radioactive Trace, or EURT. The shape was long and narrow, roughly 180 miles long and 18 miles wide, because the release was abrupt, and the wind remained relatively stable in direction and speed. While the heaviest particles fell near the plant, the finer ones traveled further, gradually settling into the soil along the way. Some areas received much higher doses than others, creating pockets of extreme risk right next to regions that seemed perfectly normal. There were no signs, no fences, no warnings. The soil looked the same. The trees stayed green. Radiation has no smell, no color. You could pass through there on a beautiful day, the sun shining, birds singing, while the ground emitted enough beta particles to fry your DNA as you admired the view. The primary isotopes that defined the EURT were fission products like strontium-90, cerium-144, and zirconium-95. Hundreds of thousands of people lived within or on the edges of this trail. They continued planting, harvesting, raising livestock, and consuming local food. Without information, there was no reason to change their habits. The EURT turned a localized explosion into a long-term regional disaster. The contamination was diluted across the territory and through time, making it hard to perceive and even harder to manage. By the time authorities began to react, the trace was already etched into the soil and into the bodies of the population. No official statement was ever issued. To the Soviet state, the accident simply did not exist. Nikita Khrushchev, then leader of the Soviet Union, never made a single public announcement regarding what had happened. Newspapers and radio stations reported no explosion. When residents reported an unusual glow in the sky, the official explanation was that it was a rare aurora borealis, a natural phenomenon occurring at unusual latitudes. The story was repeated without question. This silence extended to the healthcare system. Doctors treating patients with obvious symptoms of radiation exposure were forbidden from using terms like radiation or radiation sickness in medical records. Diagnoses were replaced by vague phrasing, administrative codes, or generic classifications. The problem could be treated clinically, but it could never be named officially. Without a diagnosis, there were no statistics. Without statistics, there was no disaster. The suffering existed in the bodies of the people, but it did not exist in the records of the state. By keeping the accident out of public discourse, the government preserved the image of absolute control over its nuclear program. Silence protected the state, the nuclear industry, and the narrative of power, at the cost of leaving hundreds of thousands of people exposed without a single word of explanation. By the time the evacuations began, the disaster was already cemented. Decisions were made slowly, village by village, based on radiation readings. In many cases, residents only realized something was wrong when state agents arrived with orders to leave, no explanation given, and no option to refuse. There were places where the population remained for months, even years, before being removed. The people had no idea what they had breathed in or ingested. Livestock were slaughtered on the spot, crops were buried, personal belongings were left behind. More than 20 villages, with over 11,000 inhabitants, were evacuated and completely demolished. Entire towns were scrubbed from the map. Houses were crushed by bulldozers. Streets were covered in fresh soil. The goal was to prevent anyone from returning and to keep contaminated dust from rising. On paper, these places ceased to exist. After the evacuations, the population exposed along the Teka River, and the radioactive trail was closely monitored by doctors and scientists linked to the Soviet nuclear program. State institutes began a systematic observation that would last for decades. Blood samples were collected regularly, children had their bone growth measured, cases of anemia, leukemia, and cancer were recorded with technical precision. The people knew they were sick, but they didn't know why. The word radiation remained absent. In medical records, the language was coded. The primary focus was internal radiation, something poorly understood at the time. Strontium-90, embedded in their bones, allowed scientists to observe long-term effects directly on the bone marrow. From a scientific standpoint, the data was invaluable. But the monitoring didn't necessarily come with medical intervention. The goal was to observe what happened to bodies subjected to radiation. While the rest of the world knew nothing, those people grew old being measured, compared, and archived, without ever being officially told what had actually happened to them. For nearly 2 decades, the Kyshtym disaster remained unknown to the world, except for the CIA. Since the early 1950s, U-2 spy planes had been flying over the Ural region. They had satellite photos showing the trail of destruction, the EURT, and more importantly, they had sensors that detected radioactive particles in the atmosphere that could only come from a large-scale disaster. American intelligence knew the tank lid had blown before the dust had even settled, but the CIA and the American government decided to keep their mouths shut for one purely strategic reason. At the time, the U.S. was selling the world on the idea of atoms for peace. They were building dozens of nuclear reactors on American soil. If they shouted to the world that a nuclear waste tank in Russia had exploded and wiped cities off the map, the American public would panic and demand the closure of every plant. It was one of the greatest cases of "I didn't see a thing" in history. In the 1970s, articles published in the Soviet Union began to draw attention for a strange detail. They described severe radiation effects on plants, animals, and human populations in the Urals, but never explained the source of the contamination. Essentially, Soviet scientists were publishing their studies to gain prestige, but they couldn't say where the data came from. They were so addicted to appearing in scientific journals that they accidentally started posting spoilers of the disaster. This caught the eye of Zoris Medvedev, a Soviet biologist known for questioning the regime's scientific orthodoxy. Medvedev didn't have access to secret documents. He had something better: the ability to connect the dots. Medvedev gathered these scattered studies, compared dates, regions, and contamination levels, and realized this was no natural phenomenon. In 1976, while in exile, Medvedev published an article in New Scientist explicitly raising the hypothesis of a catastrophic explosion. The initial reaction in the West, which until then knew nothing, was one of skepticism. American authorities downplayed Medvedev's findings, avoiding any narrative of a major catastrophe. But Medvedev did not back down. In 1979, he published the book Nuclear Disaster in the Urals, presenting a detailed reconstruction of what might have happened. The text contained no official documents because they didn't exist, but it connected scientific data and geographical inconsistencies with uncomfortable precision. The name Kyshtym, as used in the title of this video, was adopted out of sheer convenience. It was the only city in the region the Soviets allowed on official maps. In practice, it was a historical injustice. Kyshtym, which had no fault in the accident, inherited the reputation of being a radioactive wasteland. Meanwhile, the true culprit, the secret military complex of Mayak, remained shielded by anonymity, continuing its operations in the shadows as if nothing had happened. At that point, the silence was no longer sustainable. Even without confirmation, the idea of a massive hidden disaster began to circulate. On one side, the Soviet Union denied and hid. On the other, the West knew enough to be suspicious, but chose not to confirm. The disaster remained in a gray zone, known behind the scenes, but absent from public debate. This balance only began to crumble in the late 1980s. Soviet glasnost, and above all Chernobyl, made denial politically impossible. Admitting Kyshtym was less of a moral choice and more of a political necessity. They wanted to settle the accounts before anyone could audit the damages. In 1989, more than 30 years after the explosion, the government finally acknowledged a major nuclear accident in the Urals. But the admission was handled with extreme caution. It was described simply as an industrial accident. There was no clear mention of tank number 14, no detailed casualty numbers. The language was technical, minimal, and defensive. Recognition paved the way for compensation programs, but they were limited and buried in bureaucracy. Many were left out. To this day, the Mayak complex continues to operate. The city of Ozyorsk remains closed. The territory still carries invisible exclusion zones that do not appear on any map. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. If you want to continue seeing how humanity destroys itself in different ways, you can check out our playlists. Once again, thank you. And with luck, we'll meet again in the next video.